They found the Harlow twins in the Appalachians in 1961, and their confession changed everything. On a cold March morning, when the fog still clung to the hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, two state social workers stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Margaret Hendricks and Thomas Caldwell had been following up on a routine welfare check, tracing rumors that had circulated through the valley for decades about a family living in complete isolation 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The path to the Harlow property was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and wild rhododendron. The workers had to abandon their Ford station wagon a mile from the site and continue on foot through mud that sucked at their boots. The air smelled of pine and decay. When they finally emerged into a clearing, they saw it, a ramshackle cabin constructed from weathered timber, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and neglect. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, the only sign of life. Margaret knocked on the door 3 times before it creaked open. What she saw made her gasp. 2 identical figures stood before her, pale as moonlight, with hair so white it seemed to glow in the dim interior. They were 23 years old, though their stunted frames made them appear childlike. Their eyes were an unnatural shade of blue, almost translucent, and they squinted against the weak daylight as if the sun itself burned them. "We're from the State Welfare Office," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the shock. "We're here to check on the Harlow family." The twins said nothing. They simply stared with those unsettling eyes, their thin lips slightly parted. Behind them in the shadows of the cabin, movement suggested others were present. Margaret noticed their hands then, the fingers webbed together at the base, the skin stretched tight like the membrane of a bat's wing. One twin's left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly malformed from birth. "Are your parents home?" Margaret asked gently. The twin on the right finally spoke, her voice high and strained. "Mama's been gone 7 winters. Papa don't talk no more." The dialect was thick, almost incomprehensible, a relic of isolated Appalachian speech patterns that had evolved in complete separation from the outside world. Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret. This was worse than they had imagined. Inside, the cabin was a nightmare of squalor and darkness. 3 rooms, no electricity, no running water. The floor was packed, earth covered with rotting animal hides. In the corner, an elderly man sat motionless in a wooden chair, his body twisted into an impossible position, his spine curved like a question mark. His jaw hung slack, revealing only 3 teeth. Drool pooled in his lap. His eyes tracked the visitors but showed no comprehension. "That's Papa," the other twin said. "He'd been like that since we was girls." Margaret's professional training took over, pushing aside her horror. She began asking questions, documenting everything in her notebook with trembling hands. The twins' names were Violet and Iris Harlow. They had been born here in this very cabin, delivered by their own mother without any medical assistance. They had never been to a doctor, never attended school, never ventured beyond the boundaries of their family's 40-acre property. "How many of you live here?" Thomas asked. Violet, or perhaps Iris, it was impossible to tell them apart, gestured toward a back room. "There's Samuel and Ruth, they's younger. And Papa, he just sits." When Thomas pushed aside the tattered curtains separating the rooms, he found 2 more siblings. Samuel was 19, his body grotesquely disproportionate, with a massive head that seemed too heavy for his thin neck. His eyes bulged from their sockets, and his tongue protruded slightly from his mouth, too large for the space it occupied. Ruth was 16, her face relatively normal except for a severe cleft palate that split her upper lip and nose, leaving a gaping cavity. She hid when she saw the strangers, whimpering like an injured animal. The smell in the cabin was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste. Margaret fought the urge to vomit. These people had been living in medieval conditions in 1961, while the rest of America watched television and drove automobiles and worried about the Soviet Union. It was as if time had stopped in this forgotten corner of the mountains. "We need to get you help," Margaret said. "All of you need to come with us." The twins looked at each other, communicating in that silent way twins sometimes do. Then Violet spoke. "We can't leave Papa. He raised us. He kept us safe." "Safe from what?" Thomas asked. "From the hate. From the people who don't understand." It was then that Margaret noticed the photographs on the mantel, daguerreotypes from the previous century mixed with more recent pictures. All showed Harlows, generation after generation, and all bore the same telltale signs: the pale skin, the white hair, the unusual eyes, the physical deformities. This wasn't just one generation of neglect. This was a bloodline that had been folding in on itself for over 100 years. The investigation that followed would reveal a family tree that looked more like a tangled vine, branches reconnecting with themselves in ways nature never intended. But that first day, standing in that cabin of horrors, Margaret and Thomas knew only that they had discovered something terrible, something that raised questions about how such suffering could exist unnoticed for so long. As they prepared to leave and return with more authorities, Violet grabbed Margaret's arm with her webbed hand. "Please, ma'am, don't let them separate us. We's all we got. Family is all that matters." Margaret couldn't answer. She pulled away gently and walked out into the clean mountain air, breathing deeply, trying to cleanse her lungs of the cabin's corruption. Behind her, the Harlow twins stood in the doorway, ghostly and tragic, products of a darkness that ran deeper than poverty or ignorance. This was a darkness written into their very bones, passed down through blood that should never have mixed. Confira se j inscrito nest, canal porc historias como esta. Historias que associated tenduin errar, precisem ser cantadas, para que nunca mais se repetem. The Harlow family tree, when researchers finally pieced it together from county records, church registries, and census documents, told a story that made even hardened social workers weep. It began in 1847 when Jeremiah Harlow, a fur trapper from Virginia, purchased 40 acres in what was then the wildest part of the Appalachian wilderness. He brought with him his wife, Sarah, and their 5 children. They were seeking isolation, escaping something in their past that the records never clearly explained. By 1870, census records showed 12 people living on the Harlow property, but only 2 surnames, Harlow. Jeremiah's children had married each other. His eldest son, Nathaniel, had taken his sister Rebecca as his wife. His daughter Martha had married her brother Elijah. The younger children, still minors at the time of that census, would follow the same pattern. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, enforced. A family policy that would seal their fate for generations. Dr. Harold Myers, a geneticist from Charleston who was called in to examine the Harlow case in April 1961, spent 3 weeks reviewing the family's history. His report, filed with the state medical board, described a genetic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion across a century. The medical terminology was clinical, but the implications were devastating. The Harlow family represents an extreme case of consanguinity extending through at least 5 generations, Dr. Myers wrote. The coefficient of inbreeding exceeds any documented case in American medical literature. The physical manifestations observed in the current generation, the albinism, the skeletal deformities, the cognitive impairments, the organ malformations, are the inevitable result of recessive genetic disorders being expressed when the same damaged genes meet again and again across generations. The twins, Violet and Iris, were the daughters of Walter Harlow and his sister Grace. Walter himself had been the product of a union between first cousins. Grace's mother had been her father's niece. The family tree didn't branch. It looped back on itself endlessly, a genetic spiral descending into darkness. Dr. Myers examined all 4 surviving siblings in a temporary clinic set up in the county courthouse. The state had removed them from the cabin over their tearful protests, separating them from their father, who was deemed incompetent and in need of institutional care. The examination findings were documented in painstaking detail. Violet and Iris, despite being twins, showed slightly different manifestations of their genetic disorders. Both had oculocutaneous albinism type 1, a severe form that left them with virtually no pigment in their skin, hair, or eyes. Their vision was extremely poor, limited to about 20 feet. Both had syndactyly of the hands and feet, the webbing between digits ranging from slight to complete fusion. Violet's left humerus had failed to develop properly, leaving her arm twisted and weak. Iris had a heart murmur, a malformed valve that made her tire easily and left her lips perpetually blue. Samuel's condition was even more severe. His cranium measured abnormally large, the result of hydrocephalus that had gone untreated since birth. Fluid had built up in his skull, pressing against his brain, causing developmental delays and seizures. His eyes protruded because of a condition called exophthalmos, related to thyroid dysfunction. His skeletal structure showed signs of rickets, despite his age. The bones soft and curved from generations of vitamin D deficiency in a family that rarely ventured into sunlight. Ruth, the youngest, had been born with a complete bilateral cleft lip and palate, a condition that should have been surgically corrected in infancy. Instead, she had lived 16 years unable to eat properly, unable to speak clearly, suffering from chronic ear infections and respiratory problems. Her face bore the devastating mark of her heritage, a wound that ran from her upper lip through her nose, exposing the bone beneath. But the physical deformities were only part of the story. Dr. Myers conducted cognitive assessments that revealed the intellectual damage wrought by generations of inbreeding. Violet and Iris could read at perhaps a third-grade level, taught by their mother before her death. Samuel could not read at all and struggled to count beyond 20. Ruth's cleft palate made assessment difficult, but her comprehension seemed severely limited. What you must understand, Dr. Myers explained to the County Welfare Board in May 1961, is that these children are not unintelligent because of lack of education. Their brains have been physically compromised by their genetic heritage. The same genes that cause their physical deformities have affected their neural development. This is what happens when a bloodline becomes too close, when the genetic diversity necessary for healthy human development is eliminated. The historical records revealed how this had happened. The Harlow family had developed a culture of isolation that reinforced itself across generations. Church records from the local Baptist congregation showed that Harlows stopped attending services in the 1880s after facing ridicule for their appearance. A diary entry from a traveling preacher in 1891 described visiting the Harlow cabin and being disturbed by the pale, strange children who hide from the light like creatures of the night. By the early 1900s, the Harlows had become local legend, a cautionary tale told by mountain families to their children. Don't go near Harlow land, parents warned. There's something wrong with those people. The isolation became absolute. The family relied on hunting, a small garden, and occasional trade for supplies. They married within the family not just by preference but by necessity. No one from outside would marry a Harlow. The psychological records were equally disturbing. When psychiatrist Dr. Ellen Crawford interviewed the siblings in June 1961, she discovered a family dynamic that was deeply dysfunctional. The twins spoke of their father, Walter, with a mixture of fear and devotion. He had been the absolute authority in the family, making all decisions, controlling all aspects of their lives. Their mother, Grace, had died in 1954, bleeding out after trying to deliver a stillborn child alone in the cabin. Walter had forbidden them from seeking help, from contacting authorities, from leaving the property. He said the outside world would hurt us, Violet told Dr. Crawford during one session. He said people would put us in cages, study us like animals. He said we was special, that we was pure, that we had to keep the family line clean. This was the ideology that had sustained the Harlow family's isolation. A twisted belief that their condition made them special rather than victims, that their genetic purity was something to preserve rather than a nightmare to end. Walter had learned this from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. It was a delusion passed down as carefully as the damaged genes themselves. The community's role in this tragedy could not be ignored. For generations, people in McDowell County had known something was wrong at the Harlow place. There had been whispers, rumors, occasional sightings of pale figures moving through the forest, but no one had intervened. The culture of mountain independence, of minding one's own business, had allowed this horror to continue unchecked. We thought they wanted to be left alone, one elderly neighbor told investigators. It wasn't our place to interfere. Mountain folks got their own ways, but this wasn't independence. This was abandonment. This was a community's failure to protect the most vulnerable among them. By June 1961, as the full scope of the Harlow tragedy became clear, the questions shifted from what had happened to why it had been allowed to happen for so long. The confession came on a humid afternoon in July 1961, 3 months after the Harlow siblings had been removed from their mountain cabin and placed in the care of the state welfare system. They were living in a supervised group home in Charleston, struggling to adapt to a world they had never known existed. Electric lights frightened them. Running water seemed like magic. The noise of traffic sent them into panic attacks. They clung to each other desperately, the only constant in a universe that had turned incomprehensible. Dr. Ellen Crawford had been working with Violet and Iris twice a week, trying to help them process their trauma and adjust to their new reality. The sessions were slow, difficult work. The twins spoke in their private language as often as English, a hybrid dialect mixed with words they had invented for concepts they had never encountered. Trust came reluctantly, if at all. But on that July afternoon, something shifted. Maybe it was the thunderstorm that rolled through Charleston, reminding Violet of the mountain range she had known all her life. Maybe it was the medication that had been prescribed to help with her anxiety finally taking effect. Or maybe it was simply that the burden of secrets had become too heavy to carry any longer. "I need to tell you something," Violet said. Her nearly colorless eyes fixed on her hands, those webbed fingers knotted together in her lap. "About Mama. About how she really died. Dr. Crawford set down her pen, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. Iris sat beside her sister, silent but trembling. The two of them seemed to communicate wordlessly, and after a moment Iris nodded, giving her permission. "The baby that killed Mama," Violet continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't just any baby, it was mine." The confession that unfolded over the next 2 hours was more horrifying than anything the investigators had imagined. Grace Harlow had not died trying to deliver her own child in 1954. She had died trying to deliver her daughter's child, a child fathered by Grace's own husband, Walter, who was simultaneously the father, grandfather, and uncle of the unborn infant. Violet was only 16 when it happened. She described how her father had begun coming to the room she shared with Iris after their mother had become too ill to bear more children. Grace had suffered complications after Ruth's birth that left her unable to conceive. Walter, obsessed with continuing the Harlow line, had turned to his daughters. "He said it was our duty," Violet explained, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "He said the family line had to continue. He said we was the only ones pure enough. Mama knew. She didn't stop him. She said it was God's will that the Harlows had always kept the blood clean. The pregnancy had been difficult. Violet was malnourished, her body still underdeveloped. When labor began in the winter of 1954, it became clear something was catastrophically wrong. The baby was positioned badly, and Violet's narrow pelvis made delivery impossible. Grace had tried to help, tried to turn the baby, tried everything she knew from the births she had attended, but there was too much internal damage, too much bleeding. Mama told me to push," Violet said, her voice breaking. "She kept saying push, push, but the baby wouldn't come. And then there was blood everywhere. So much blood. And Mama was screaming, and Papa was yelling at her to fix it, to save the baby, save the line. But there was nothing nobody could do." Grace had bled out on the cabin floor while her daughter watched. The baby, a boy, had been stillborn, his body so malformed that even birth would have been impossible. Walter had buried them both in the woods behind the cabin, marking the graves with rough stones. He had told Samuel and Ruth that their mother had died of a fever. He had sworn Violet and Iris to silence, threatening them with abandonment if they ever spoke of what had really happened. He said if anyone ever found out, they would take us away and punish us, Iris added, speaking for the first time in the session. He said we would be blamed, that we would be put in prison or worse, so we never told nobody. Not for 7 years, but the confessions didn't end there. Over the following weeks, as Dr. Crawford gently encouraged them to share their experiences, a fuller picture of life in the Harlow cabin emerged. Walter had controlled every aspect of his children's lives with brutality masked as protection. He had beaten Samuel severely whenever the boy's seizures embarrassed him. He had refused to allow Ruth to be seen by any outsider, ashamed of her facial deformity. He had enforced absolute isolation, telling his children that the outside world was evil, that strangers would hurt them, that only family could be trusted. The twisted logic of the Harlow family became clear. For generations they had convinced themselves that their isolation was a choice, that their genetic deterioration was a mark of purity rather than a disaster. They had created a closed universe where the only truth was what Walter declared, where suffering was normal, where the obvious horrors of their situation were reframed as evidence of their special status. Dr. Crawford's notes from this period make for difficult reading. These young people have been victims not just of genetic circumstance, but of systematic conditioning that has warped their understanding of normal human relationships, she wrote. They have been taught that victimization is love, that suffering is duty, that their physical and cognitive disabilities are marks of divine favor rather than preventable tragedies. Helping them understand the truth of their situation while not destroying their entire worldview may be impossible. The legal implications of Violet's confession were complex. Walter Harlow was still alive, institutionalized in a facility for the mentally incompetent after being removed from the cabin. But could he be prosecuted for what had happened? The statutes regarding familial relations and criminal conduct in 1961, Virginia and West Virginia were murky when it came to cases this extreme. Moreover, Violet herself was terrified of testifying, of seeing her father again, of making public what had happened to her. The state attorney general's office debated for months about how to proceed. Some argued that Walter should face criminal charges. Others pointed out that he was now barely functional, his mind destroyed by the same genetic factors that had ruined his children's lives. A trial would accomplish nothing except further trauma for victims who had already suffered beyond measure. In the end, no charges were filed. Walter Harlow would remain institutionalized until his death 3 years later. The confession, however, changed everything about how authorities viewed the case. That this wasn't just a family that had fallen through the cracks of the social welfare system. This was a multi-generational pattern of entrapment where each generation had been conditioned to perpetuate the same cycle of isolation and genetic destruction. Dr. Myers, the geneticist, updated his report with the new information. The Harlow case demonstrates how cultural factors and genetic factors can create a feedback loop of increasing pathology, he wrote. The genetic damage led to social isolation, which led to further inbreeding, which led to more genetic damage, which reinforced the isolation. Breaking this cycle required external intervention, but such intervention came generations too late to prevent the suffering we now observe. Now pause for a moment and think about what you've just heard. Think about Violet standing in that cabin 7 years ago, watching her mother die because of something that should never have happened. If her story has moved you, if you believe someone needs to hear this truth, leave a comment right now saying, "Violet, your voice matters." Let her know, across the years, that her suffering was not in silence. By autumn of 1961, the Harlow case had attracted attention beyond West Virginia. Medical journals requested permission to document the case for educational purposes. Geneticists from universities across the country wanted to study the family as an example of extreme consanguinity. Journalists tried to interview the siblings, seeking the sensational details of their story. The Harlows, who had lived in absolute obscurity for generations, suddenly found themselves at the center of unwanted fascination. Dr. Crawford worked to shield her patients from this attention. The siblings were not specimens to be exhibited. They were human beings who deserved dignity and privacy, even as their case offered important lessons for medicine and social policy. She restricted access to the group home, granted only a handful of carefully controlled interviews, and advocated fiercely for her patients' rights. The medical interventions that followed were both miraculous and heartbreaking. Ruth, at 16, underwent her first surgery to repair her cleft palate in September 1961. The procedure, performed by a skilled surgeon at Charleston General Hospital, took 6 hours. When Ruth emerged from anesthesia, she could not stop crying. For the first time in her life, she could close her mouth properly. She could breathe through her nose. Within weeks, as the swelling subsided, she began attempting words that had been impossible before. Practicing sounds in front of a mirror with a speech therapist, marveling at her own reflection. She asked me if she looked normal now, Dr. Crawford recorded in her notes. I told her she looked beautiful, which is true, but I could see in her eyes that she understood the deeper question. Could she ever be normal after everything that had been done to her? That's a question surgery cannot answer. Samuel's condition presented more challenges. The hydrocephalus had caused permanent brain damage. A shunt was surgically implanted to drain the excess fluid, but the cognitive impairments remained. He would never live independently, never hold employment, never function beyond the level of a young child. Yet he seemed happier in the group home than he had ever been in the cabin. He loved television, sitting for hours watching programs he couldn't fully understand but found endlessly fascinating. He loved the regular meals, the clean clothes, the kind staff members who treated him with gentleness. The twins' albinism could not be cured, but their vision was improved with specially prescribed glasses, and they learned to use sunscreen and protective clothing when outdoors. Violet underwent physical therapy for her malformed arm, gaining some increased range of motion. Both twins were enrolled in adult education classes, learning to read more fluently, to perform basic mathematics, to navigate the world beyond the mountains. But the psychological healing proved far more difficult than the physical. The twins suffered nightmares, panic attacks, episodes of dissociation. They struggled with the concept that what had happened to them was wrong, that their father's actions had not been expressions of love but violations. Their entire framework for understanding reality had to be rebuilt from the ground up. How do you explain to someone that their whole life has been a lie? Dr. Crawford wrote in a professional journal article published in 1962, names changed to protect her patients' identities. How do you help them mourn not just for what was done to them but for the normal life they never had, the family they should have been born into, the future that was stolen before they were even born? The investigation into how the Harlow situation had been allowed to continue for so long revealed systemic failures at every level. County welfare officials had received reports about the family as far back as the 1920s, but had never followed up. Local schools had no record of any Harlow children ever enrolling, yet no truancy officers had investigated. Health officials had no documentation of births or deaths on the Harlow property for decades, but had raised no alarms. A special commission was formed by the West Virginia State Legislature in December 1961 to examine the case and recommend policy changes. The hearings made headlines across the nation. Witnesses testified about the culture of isolation in Appalachia, the lack of resources for rural welfare services, the gaps in legal frameworks that allowed families to disappear from official oversight. What happened to the Harlow family is not an isolated incident, testified Dr. Robert Harrison, a sociologist from the University of Virginia. Throughout rural America, in isolated communities from Appalachia to the Ozarks to the swamps of Louisiana, there are families living in conditions of extreme poverty and isolation. Some of these families have practiced inbreeding for generations. We don't know how many because we have never looked systematically. The Harlow case forces us to acknowledge a problem we have preferred to ignore. The Commission's final report, published in March 1962, called for sweeping reforms, mandatory birth registration, regular welfare checks on isolated families, mandatory schooling enforcement, increased funding for rural social services, and legal clarification regarding the state's authority to intervene in cases of suspected familial harm. West Virginia began implementing these recommendations, though progress was slow and underfunded. For the Harlow siblings, life continued in its strange new patterns. By 1963, Ruth had undergone 3 more surgeries and had progressed enough to begin working part-time in the group home's kitchen, a job she took pride in. Samuel had found a rhythm in supervised group activities, his seizures controlled by medication. The twins had moved into a semi-independent living apartment with continued supervision, learning to grocery shop, to use public transportation, to exist in a world that still felt alien but was becoming familiar. Yet they never stopped asking about their father. Despite everything Walter had done, despite the harm he had caused, he remained in their minds as the central figure of their lives. When he died of a stroke in the institutional hospital in 1964, all 4 siblings attended his funeral. They stood beside his grave in the prison cemetery, these pale, damaged children, weeping for a man who had destroyed them. I asked Violet why she was crying, Dr. Crawford wrote in her personal journal that night. She said, because he was my papa, and I loved him, and he was all I knew. That's the cruelest thing about what was done to these children. They were taught to love the source of their destruction. Even now, knowing the truth, they cannot help but mourn him. That's the depth of the damage, goes beyond the body, beyond the mind, into the very formation of the heart. The Harlow cabin was demolished in 1965. The land sold by the state to pay for the siblings' ongoing care. Before the demolition, Dr. Myers led a team of researchers to the site one final time. They excavated the area behind the cabin where Violet had indicated the graves were located. They found the remains of Grace Harlow and her stillborn grandson, confirming Violet's confession. They also found 14 other graves, unmarked and forgotten siblings who had not survived infancy, children born too damaged to live even in that terrible place. 15 graves, Dr. Myers wrote in his final report on the Harlow case. 15 lives that ended before they really began, victims of a genetic catastrophe that was entirely preventable. For every Harlow child who survived to 1961, nearly 4 others died. That is the true mortality rate of extreme inbreeding. That is the cost of isolation and ignorance. That is what happens when a community fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The Harlow siblings lived the rest of their lives as wards of the state, never fully able to overcome the circumstances of their birth, but finding moments of happiness in their strange, circumscribed existence. Ruth married in 1972 a man she met through a church group for people with disabilities. The marriage was brief and reportedly not happy, but Ruth spoke of it afterward with pride. She had been chosen by someone, loved by someone outside her family. That meant something. Samuel died in 1979, complications from a seizure disorder that his damaged brain could never fully overcome. He was 46 years old. The twins attended his funeral, now middle-aged women themselves, their white hair and pale skin standing out starkly in the crowd of mourners. Dr. Crawford, retired but still in contact with the sisters, noted that they seemed more sad about losing their last connection to their shared past than about Samuel's death specifically. Violet and Iris lived together until Iris died of heart failure in 1991. The defective valve that had troubled her since birth finally giving out. Violet survived her twin by 12 years, living alone for the first time in her life. She learned to use a computer in her 60s, typing with her webbed fingers on a keyboard in the public library, connecting to early internet forums where she could communicate with people who never saw her face, never knew her history. In those anonymous spaces, she was just another voice, another person sharing thoughts and experiences. Dr. Crawford visited Violet shortly before her death in 2003. Violet was 74, frail and nearly blind from macular degeneration that had compounded her lifelong vision problems. They sat in the common room of the assisted living facility, drinking weak coffee, talking about the mountain cabin that had been gone for nearly 40 years. "Do you ever regret that we found you, Doctor?" Crawford asked. It was a question that had haunted her for decades. Violet thought for a long time before answering. "Sometimes I think about how life was simple before. We didn't know nothing different. We didn't know we was suffering because we thought that was just how life was. Papa said the outside world would hurt us, and in some ways he was right. Learning the truth hurt worse than anything that happened in that cabin." She paused, her pale eyes struggling to focus on Dr. Crawford's face. "But I got to see Ruth smile after her surgeries. I got to watch Samuel laugh at the television. I got to learn to read books and think thoughts Papa never wanted me to think. So maybe the hurt was worth it. Maybe knowing, even when knowing hurts, is better than not knowing." The Harlow case became a landmark in medical and social work literature. It appeared in textbooks, was cited in Supreme Court decisions regarding the state's authority to intervene in family situations, and inspired policy changes across the country. The extreme genetic damage documented in the Harlow siblings helped establish the medical understanding of why consanguinity is so dangerous, why genetic diversity is essential for human health. Dr. Myers. Research on the family contributed to the development of genetic counseling as a medical specialty. His papers detailed exactly what happens when harmful recessive genes are repeatedly expressed across generations. The accumulation of disabilities, the cascade of organ failures, the inevitable decline toward non-viability. The Harlow family tree became a cautionary diagram reproduced in genetics courses worldwide. The names changed, but the pattern unmistakable. But beyond the science and the policy, the Harlow case raised questions that remain difficult to answer even decades later. How do we balance respect for privacy and autonomy with the obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves? At what point does a community's failure to act become complicity in harm? How do we address the cultural factors that enable isolation and prevent intervention? What do we owe to victims whose suffering could have been prevented if anyone had cared enough to look? The mountain community where the Harlows had lived struggled with these questions for years. Some residents felt unfairly blamed for what had happened. Others acknowledged their collective failure. A historical marker was eventually erected near the former site of the Harlow cabin in 2008, reading, "In memory of the Harlow family who suffered in isolation, may their story remind us of our obligation to care for all members of our community, especially those who have no voice to ask for help." The marker does not explain exactly what happened. It does not detail the genetic horrors, the generational cycle of inbreeding, the preventable deaths. Perhaps that's appropriate. The specifics are documented in medical journals and government reports for those who need to know, but the marker serves as a memorial to suffering, a reminder that behind every cautionary tale are real people who experienced real pain. Dr. Ellen Crawford died in 2015 at the age of 93. Her obituary mentioned her groundbreaking work with trauma victims and her role in reforming West Virginia's social welfare system. It did not mention the Harlow family by name, but her children knew that case had defined their mother's career, had haunted her dreams, had driven her to advocate tirelessly for the vulnerable and forgotten. In her personal papers, donated to the medical library at Marshall University, researchers found a letter written by Violet Harlow in 2002, a year before her death. The handwriting was shaky, the spelling imperfect, but the words were clear. "Dear Dr. Crawford, I wanted to thank you before I die for saving us even though we didn't want to be saved. You gave us a life outside the cabin. You taught us that we mattered, that we deserved better than what we got. I'm not sure I ever really believed you, but I'm grateful you believed it for us. When I die, will you make sure people know what happened? Not so they feel sorry for us, but so it never happens to nobody else. That's the only thing that makes the pain mean something if somebody learns from it. Thank you for everything, Violet." The letter is now part of the permanent collection, a testament to one woman's resilience, one doctor's compassion, and the terrible price of isolation. If you've watched this entire investigation, if you've stayed with the Harlow family through their darkest moments, you understand why stories like these must be told. Confira sage inscrito nes canal. Por compartil heresas verdades occultas unica manera de garanta, qa ls nunca se repitem. Se voca assistiu et aqui, por gustu dessa historia dux commentario dizendo, eu assisti et aqui, para que eu passate conhecer, e saberquem, realmente gosta das historias aqui do canal. Se essa historia impactu, voca dux sua, curtada e compartilcam, algum que precisa, Intender quo silencio nunca protege, apenas permite, quo soffrimento continue. The Harlow twins were found in the Appalachians in 1961, and their confession changed everything. It changed laws, changed medical understanding, changed how we think about family, isolation, and the obligations we have to each other. But most importantly, it gave voice to 4 people who had spent their entire lives in enforced silence, living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity persists, waiting to be recognized and honored.